Chairman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Markowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner,
We are on Shaheen right now.
Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Fetterman, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Van Hollen, Warren, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Budd, Cassidy, Collins, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Hoven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Langford, Lee, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Thune, Tillis, Wicker, Young. Mr. Marshall, no. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. McConnell, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Tuberville, no. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Schmidt, no. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Welch, aye. Ms. Slotkin, aye. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mrs. Britt, no. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Haggerty, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Warner, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 52, the nays are 48. The yeas are 48, the nays are 52. The amendment is not agreed to. Senator from New Mexico.
Mr. President, I'd like to call my amendment number 699 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
The senator from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan, proposes an amendment numbered 699.
Mr. President, we are experiencing a nationwide shortage of police officers. Police departments are stretched thin, making our communities less safe. In the worst cases, some small departments have disbanded completely. Small towns need federal dollars to bolster their ranks. The Musk-Trump freeze took funding away from our police departments and law enforcement officials. The COPS hiring program is a lifeline to many law enforcement agencies. COPS hiring grants provide funding directly to law enforcement agencies to increase their community policing capacity and crime prevention efforts. On behalf of all Americans who care about public safety, I introduce this amendment to provide increased resources for local law enforcement. This is a bipartisan issue. It should be easy. I hope my colleagues just accept it, and we don't even have to have a vote on it. There's no reason to oppose this amendment. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Senator from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. We should ensure that all law enforcement has the necessary equipment, training, and resources to keep our communities safe and thoroughly investigate crimes committed against all people. I've come to the floor and I've spoken on this many, many times in the 10 years that I've been here. Securing the border must remain the top priority in reducing crime, and this amendment does not adequately support necessary safety improvements, so I urge you to vote no.
Mr. President, I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan. Yes, sir, I got you. Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Highsmith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: also Brooks, Bennett, Blunt Rochester, Cantwell, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Padilla, Reed, Rosen, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Warner, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse. Senators voting in negative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Kramer, Crapo, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Haggerty, Hawley, Hyde-Smith, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Tuberville, and Wicker. Mr. King, Mr. King, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Justice, no. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Husted. Mr. Husted, no. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Fetterman. Mr. Fetterman, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley. No. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton. No. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff. Aye. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye.
I won't get this. On this vote, the nays are 52, the yeas are 48. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. President,
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I call up Duckworth Booker Amendment 971 and ask that it be reported by number.
Senator from Illinois, Ms. Duckworth, proposes an amendment number 971.
Mr. President, this amendment would protect the right to IVF and other fertility care, and it would require insurers to cover IVF. I know my Republican colleagues will claim that President Trump has already solved this problem, but don't be fooled. Donald Trump's recent toothless, overly vague executive order does nothing to expand access to IVF. It was just lip service from a known liar. In fact, as he's so committed to making government more efficient, he could stop wasting time and resources on more bureaucracy. The solution to this is simple.
Mr. President.
Senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, IVF is legal and accessible in all 50 states. This amendment is nothing more than a Trojan horse. It is far more expansive than they would want you to believe. It actually creates a universal right to, quote, assisted reproductive technologies, allowing future administrations to move this into human cloning and really gene-edited designer babies. It also contains no religious freedom protections. Aside from being bad policies, let's take a step back and think about when this occurred. 2 days ago, President Trump took the most pro-IVF executive action ever towards increased treatment, access, and affordability. While President Biden played politics with IVF, hoping it would help that side of the aisle win on November 5th, the American people saw through that. All 49 Republicans here in this chamber at that time said we strongly support nationwide access to IVF. We look forward over the next 90 days to work with President Trump to make sure that we increase access and affordability of treatment. And Mr. President, for that reason, today we're here to talk about border, defense, and energy. And I urge my colleagues to vote this Trojan horse down.
Questions on the amendment?
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Yes, sir. Yep, gotcha.
Ms. Baldwin.
Blumenthal. Coons. Berkeley. Scott. Cotton. Mr. Banks. Thank you. Durbin, I got you. Okay, you go. Durbin. There you go. Cruz. Heinrich. Okay. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Thank you. Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Gotcha. Thanks. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Marino, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray. I have you, yeah. Mr. Young. Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Also Brooks, Baldwin, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Collins, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murkowski, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Cassidy, Cornyn, Cotton, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Graham, Grassley, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Hoeven, no. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Crapo, no. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Tuberville, no. Mr. Husted, no. Mr. Budd, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Hawley, no. Mrs. Capito, no.
The yeas are 49. The nays are 51. The motion is not agreed to. The amendment is not agreed to. Jeez. Senate will be in order.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Mexico.
Mr. President, I call up my amendment number 101 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
The senator from New Mexico, Mr. Heinrich, proposes an amendment numbered 101.
Mr. President, I rise to offer this amendment to support grants for survivors of domestic violence and sexual abuse. Over the last several weeks, I've heard from thousands of New Mexicans about how Donald Trump and Elon Musk have thrown their lives and communities into chaos. That includes Alexandria Taylor at the New Mexico Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs. She called me about President Trump's blockade on federal grants under the Violence Against Women Act. These grants do two things. They support survivors of rape, sexual assault, sexual abuse, domestic violence, and they help law enforcement hold predators and abusers accountable. These are not woke ideas, these are American values. If you support survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, if you support law enforcement holding abusers and predators accountable, I hope you'll support this amendment.
Third debate. The question occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The noes appear to have it. The noes do have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, thank you. In order to protect our veterans and preserve full funding, I call up my amendment 659 and ask that it be reported by number.
Clerk will report by number.
The senator from Connecticut, Mr. Blumenthal, proposes amendment number 659.
Mr. President, this amendment very simply seeks to protect full funding for the PACT Act. All of us, or most of us, voted for it. It was bipartisan. It was one of the most significant expansions of health care and benefits for toxic exposed veterans in the VA's history. Now it's threatened because the Trump administration is aggressively attempting to decimate the VA workforce. It has imposed a freeze, and it is cutting men and women employees who are integral to fulfilling our promise under the PACT Act. We should be proud of it. We should preserve it. And if President Trump has no plans to erode the PACT Act, voting for this amendment should be easy for my Republican colleagues. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kansas.
Mr. President, this amendment is unnecessary as full funding to carry out the Sergeant First Class Heath Robinson PACT Act is not in jeopardy. The PACT Act received widespread bipartisan support, bicameral commitment, because we care about toxic exposed veterans and their families, and this is not a partisan issue. Republicans have always fought to fully fund the VA. When Republicans come back to Congress, when the VA comes back to Congress asking for more money like they did last September because of unexpected shortfalls, we said yes. The administration and this Congress will continue to prioritize full and uninterrupted funding of the VA, including funding necessary to fulfill the laws like the PACT Act that Congress enacted. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment.
If there's no further debate, the question is on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman.
Just the 3 a.m. Everyone's watching. Yeah.
Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins.
Just better than the one sleeping, right?
I do not, Senator. Ms. Collins. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Highsmith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mr. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker. I have you sign something. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Also Brooks, Baldwin, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Hawley, Hickenlooper, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Reed, Rosen, Schiff, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Welch. Senators voting the negative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Haggerty, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Justice, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Paul, Ricketts, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, and Wicker. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Budd, no. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Husted. Mr. Husted, no. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz. Aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer. Aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley. No. Mr. McConnell. No.
Yeas are 47, nays are 52. Amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. President.
Senate Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I think for the benefit of all members, I hope that very soon we'll have a final agreement that will enable us to wind this down and with a finite number of votes. And when that happens, I want to ask everybody to be in their seats so that we can move fairly quickly through those. And in the intervening time period where they're working that out, we have a couple more amendments. I'm going to ask unanimous consent that the following amendments be the next amendments in order, that the amendments be reported by number with no amendments in order prior to a vote in relation to the amendments. Markey 911, Coons 1223.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, I call up my amendment number 911 and ask that it be reported by number.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, proposes amendment number 911.
Mr. President, funding for Alzheimer's research at the NIH is essential. Nearly 7 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's right now, and if nothing changes, 15 million Americans, 15 million baby boomers will have Alzheimer's by 2050 with a cost of $1 trillion a year to our healthcare system. We need to tackle this challenge head on by increasing funding for NIH research for Alzheimer's. Trump and DOJ have already cut and slowed down NIH research, interfering with our ability to cure this disease. This is a Make America Sick agenda. A no on this amendment means taking away hope from millions of Americans with Alzheimer's and their families. After the Bush billionaire tax cut in 2001, the NIH budget was cut in spending power by 20% over the next 5 years. We must guarantee that Alzheimer's research is protected. I urge and I vote.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kansas.
I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. As we all know by now, the purpose of this budget resolution is to unlock reconciliation so we can once again secure the border and keep America safe. I do look forward to working with the senator from Massachusetts to prevent and better treat Alzheimer's, but the reserve funds in this instance are unnecessary and distract and delay the budgeting process. We need targeted solutions, not broad funding that doesn't directly address the immediate needs. I urge a no vote. I yield back.
Question is on the amendment. All in favor say aye. All opposed, no. Noes appear to have it. Noes do have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. President.
Senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, I call up my amendment number 1223 and ask that it be reported by number.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Delaware, Mr. Coons, proposes an amendment number 1223.
Mr. President, colleagues, unvetted and unaccountable DOJ agents have seized control of government systems and databases that contain vast troves of personally identifying sensitive information about nearly every American. Financial data, health data, social security numbers, home addresses. The risks to our privacy are immense, and the opportunities for corruption alarming. The possibility that unqualified and inexperienced individuals will break critical systems through malice or incompetence is chilling. In the past few weeks, I've received literally thousands of calls from concerned constituents, and I expect many of my colleagues have as well. Musk and his DOJ bureaucrats are accessing private data, and I am urging a yes vote on this amendment that would prohibit their access to this data or misusing private information. Voters are worried. They're worried that if they say the wrong thing or speak up against Trump or DOJ, their bank account information will end up on Twitter, their tax return won't come, or their family member won't get their Social Security check. I urge a yes vote on Amendment 1223.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment.
This amendment is unnecessary. We already have laws on the books to protect people's information. The most recent cases I can remember of leaking information like this involved an IRS contractor who illegally leaked the tax returns of President Trump, Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos to the delight of many on the other side of the aisle. That person, fortunately, though, is now in jail, which proves the point that we already have laws in place to take care of this. This amendment is a thinly veiled attempt to prevent DOJ from doing the constructive job of finding waste. This is an amendment that says it's okay to spend $2 million in Guatemala on sex change surgery. This is an amendment that says it's okay to look the other way. Transgender comic books in Peru are great. This is an amendment that says it's okay to do trans operas in Colombia. This is an amendment that attacks people who are looking to save our money and spend it on legitimate diplomacy, not crazy, loony, left-wing ideas. I am done.
Mr. President.
Questions on the amendment?
Mr. President, how much time do I have remaining?
All time's expired.
I'll accept a voice vote.
Questions on the amendment? All in favor say aye. All opposed, no. Noes appear to have it. Noes do have it. Amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the following amendments be the final amendments in order, that the amendments be reported by number, that following disposition of the amendments, the Senate vote on adoption of the concurrent resolution as amended with no intervening action or debate. Finally, if agreed to, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table. Lujan, number 957, Warren 734, Kelly 984, King 198, Lee 922, Blunt Rochester 311, Murray Durbin 880, and Merkley 1207.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Yeah, and some will be.
Marshall will speak against the
Mr. President.
Further ask consent that these be 10-minute votes.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Mexico.
Mr. President, 41.2 million Americans rely on SNAP to put food on the table. Mr. President, I'd like to call my amendment number 957 and ask it to be reported by number.
Clerk will report.
Senator from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan, proposes an amendment numbered 957.
Mr. President, 41.2 million Americans rely on SNAP to put food on the table, and 40% of SNAP recipients are children. The Republican budget resolution before us tonight will dramatically slash nutrition, conservation, and other farm programs for our children, families, and farmers, all to pay for the Trump tax scam, and we all know it's going to only benefit the wealthiest Americans. Now, I want to get a farm bill done, and I think most of us here want to do that. Taking critical federal dollars from our rural communities will make that nearly impossible. And that's not all. This means that costs will go up for families across America at a time when prices are already high. The result, children and families will go hungry. We all know that that's unacceptable. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kansas.
Mr. President, I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Striking the all-powerful Agriculture Committee's reconciliation instruction will make it more difficult to pay for critical improvements for border security and our national defense. A vote for this amendment indicates that Democrats don't believe there is a single area of waste, fraud, or abuse in our federal nutrition programs. In 2022 alone, the SNAP program had an overpayment rate of 10%, which amounts to billions of dollars in erroneous payments. Republicans will find common sense savings in the Ag Committee's jurisdiction while ensuring we have a well-targeted nutrition safety net for those in need. I urge a no vote. I yield back.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk, call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Marino, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Hawley, Hoven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Marino, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Lankford, no. Mr. Coons, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Mullen, no. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Welch, aye. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Sullivan, no.
On this amendment, the yeas are 47, nays are 53. The amendment is not agreed to.
President,
Senator from Massachusetts.
I call up my amendment 734 and ask that it be reported by number.
Clerk will report.
Senator from Massachusetts, Ms. Warren, proposes amendment number 734.
As we begin the budget process, Democrats are asking Republicans questions about the basic principles of what they're planning to do. And the first question is whether there is anyone who is so rich that Republicans think they don't need a tax giveaway. My amendment says anyone who earns more than $10 million a year won't get a tax cut in the new Republican budget. And I want to know if Republicans will agree to that. I urge everyone, Democrat or Republican, to say yes. Mr. President, I yield.
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, it seems to me that it is important, as we conclude tonight, that we admit to the American people what we know to be true ourselves. And that is that most of these amendments are a fiction. It's professional wrestling. It's The Undertaker versus Andre the Giant. They've been all foam and no beer, all salt and no tequila. Unless you do your research on Instagram, you know that our bill is going to be not about taxes, but about immigration and defense. There will be time to consider my friend Senator Warren's amendment, but it won't be on this bill. There'll be time to point out that 60% of the tax cuts in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act affected the middle class, Mr. President. And for that reason, I ask for a no
Time's
vote.
expired.
Mr. President,
You have 24 seconds.
in my 24 seconds, I'd like to say we all know what this is about. You're starting the process for a budget, and we just want to know the basic principle. Is there anyone so rich that Republicans think they shouldn't get a tax cut? And my view is, let's just start the bidding at $10 million. Is that rich enough to say they're not going to get a tax giveaway from the Republicans?
Mr. President.
Time's expired.
All foam, no beer.
Questions on the amendment? All in favor say aye. All opposed, no. Nayers appear to have it. Noes do have it. Amendment's not agreed to.
Mr. President, since $10 million, I ask to call up my amendment number 984 and ask that it be reported by number.
Report.
The senator from Arizona, Mr. Kelly, proposes an amendment number 984.
Mr. President, since we now know that $10 million did not meet the threshold, and we're debating who in this country is so rich that they don't need a tax cut. But that one didn't pass. So here's my proposal. Can we at least agree among all of us that no one making more than $100 million per year should get a tax cut? The median income in this country, Mr. President, is about $80,000 per year. And it would take 1,245 years for someone making the median income in America to earn $100 million. That's about 15 lifetimes. Does somebody that rich need a tax cut? I don't think so. So vote yes if you agree.
This is the last one, so I'm going to adopt Senator Kennedy's debate and urge a no vote.
The amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. No. The noes appear to have it. The noes do have it, and the amendment is not adopted.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maine.
Mr. President, this afternoon I was privileged to be on the floor and had the opportunity to listen to
amendment?
Oh, I'm sorry. I call up my amendment 198 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
Senator from Maine, Mr. King, proposes an amendment numbered 198.
As I mentioned, Mr. President, this afternoon I was on the floor. I was privileged to attend to the remarks of the distinguished chair of the Finance Committee, where he characterized the upcoming tax bill that will be before us shortly. He characterized it as principally benefiting the middle class and the working class, and denied that it would be especially or in any way beneficial to the super wealthy in our country. Well, I've always subscribed to Ronald Reagan's motto, trust but verify. So I'm simply asking to verify what the chairman of the Finance Committee said this afternoon. My amendment would just say no reduction in tax liability to someone making more than $500 million. There are about 400 families in America. $500 million seems to me a number that would justify not having a tax reduction. That's all the amendment does. No tax reduction in liability for those making more than $500 million. I urge a yes vote to verify what we were told on the floor this afternoon.
Senator from Idaho.
Senator Kennedy's debate still reigns. Vote no.
On the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. No. The noes appear to have it. The noes do have it. The amendment is not adopted. Senator from Utah.
I call up my amendment number 922 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Utah, Mr. Lee, proposes an amendment numbered 922.
Mr. President, Congress, not unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, should be making our laws. Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution requires nothing less. And yet we generate about 100,000 pages of new law a year that's choking the American people. The prior administration imposed countless rules and regulations that imposed trillions in new economic costs on the private sector. Many of these rules have been estimated to increase federal spending, federal mandatory outlays by hundreds of billions of dollars without congressional approval. The federal government already spends too much money, and this has contributed to persistent inflation in the last couple of years and a debt level that will soon reach record level highs that we cannot sustain. Congress shouldn't allow regulatory-driven spending to continue to worsen our country's fiscal and economic health. I encourage my colleagues to support my amendment to demonstrate to the American people that we're serious about reducing excessive regulatory burdens. So what we're trying to do is to push pause on these to bring about a reduction in these mandatory outlays. I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment.
Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I appreciate my colleagues' commitment to empowering the legislative branch of government, and we have worked together on a bill to rein in the presidential abuse of emergency powers, and I hope that we can get that across the finish line sometime this Congress. Unfortunately, I'm concerned that this amendment sets up a complex and arguably unconstitutional legislative scheme to get rid of regulations and undermine the bicameral legislative process. Under the regulatory approval scheme that this amendment tees up, one chamber of Congress could effectively nullify a law previously passed by the whole of Congress simply by not approving a rule of implementation. This amendment also undermines agencies' ability to implement key environmental, health, and safety laws, endangering the American people. If Congress wants to repeal a law, we should repeal the law, not create some new arcane process to sabotage implementation. And I welcome the opportunity to work with colleagues to pass legislation to strengthen the power of Congress, including to ensure that the President cannot tear up bipartisan funding bills enacted by Congress. But I urge my colleagues to reject this potentially unconstitutional and dangerous deregulatory amendment.
Recharacterization
All
of
time
the
has
amendment.
expired.
I call for the ayes and nays.
All time has expired. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Merkley. Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moreno. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Haggerty. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Deans, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: Alsobrooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt-Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye.
yeas are 57, the nays are 53, the nays are 47, the amendment is agreed to.
In this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47, and the amendment is agreed to. Senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, I call up my amendment number 311 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Delaware, Ms. Blunt Rochester, proposes an amendment number 311.
This amendment would prevent the wrongful termination of federal employees who protect the health and safety of all Americans. At a time when our country is facing unprecedented workforce shortages, the Trump administration is thoughtlessly and callously firing thousands of public servants at the Department of Health and Human Services and other departments, putting all of us at risk. What does this mean? It means delaying cures for cancer. It means higher prescription drug costs for seniors, which we fought so hard to lower. It means higher maternity mortality rates and more American women dying needlessly giving birth. And who are these public servants? They are scientists, emergency preparedness experts, the frontline healthcare workers that we called heroes. Bottom line, it's the people who keep us safe and healthy. While Republicans work to cut taxes for billionaires, they are slashing the healthcare workforce our communities rely on. On behalf of our constituents and our country, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Senator from Kansas.
Mr. President, I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. As we've learned tonight, this budget resolution is about unlocking reconciliation to secure the border and keep Americans safe. This amendment is unnecessary and delays the budgeting process. That being said, I look forward to working with the senator from Delaware to make HHS great again. I yield back.
The question is on the amendment. All in favor say aye. All opposed say nay. The nays appear to have it. The nays do have it. The amendment is not adopted. The senator from Washington.
Number 880 and asked to be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Washington, Mrs. Murray, proposes an amendment numbered 880.
Mr. President,
The senator from Washington.
the Trump administration is working to destroy medical research as we know it with an illegal, unrealistic cap on the NIH reimbursement rate for indirect costs. It means cancer researchers laid off, life-saving clinical trials canceled, and more. And it violates the bipartisan appropriations law. I should know I helped author that provision. Republicans should know they worked with me to pass it. I yield to the senior senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, my Republican colleagues know, as I do, that President Trump's cuts, freezes, gag orders, and firings are devastating medical research at NIH. Since we get sick on a bipartisan basis, shouldn't we stand together on a bipartisan basis for medical research at NIH?
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Thank you. All foam, no beer. This proposal, Mr. President, deals with health care spending. I would remind my colleagues and friends that NIH recently announced their intention to cap indirect costs for grants. Many of our universities are spending all the taxpayer money on overhead. Harvard spending 69%. Yale 67.5% on overhead. Isn't that special? Johns Hopkins 63.7%. This would make Bernie Madoff blush. I stand by I'll revise and extend my other remarks. All foam, no beer.
The amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The noes appear to have it. The noes do have it. The amendment is not adopted.
President,
Senator from Oregon.
I call up my amendment number 1207 and ask that it be recorded by number.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Oregon, Mr. Merkley, proposes an amendment number 1207.
Colleagues, this amendment encourages the opportunity for Americans to purchase prescription drugs at or near the lower prices that manufacturers charge to individuals in other similarly developed nations. Here's what every American knows. We all invest more in the research and development to develop drugs than the taxpayers of any other nation in the entire world. So we should be getting the best price, not the worst price. This amendment creates an opportunity for us to serve the American people and get them the fair prices they deserve.
Senator from Idaho.
Mr. President, I urge my colleagues to vote against this amendment today because it is not relevant to the Finance Committee instruction.
The question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to barely be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt-Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Height-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Merkley. Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moreno. Mr. Mullen? Ms. Murkowski? Mr. Murphy? Mrs. Murray? Mr. Ossoff? Mr. Padilla? Mr. Paul? Mr. Peters? Mr. Reed? Mr. Ricketts? Mr. Risch? Ms. Rosen? Mr. Rounds? Mr. Sanders? Mr. Schatz? Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schmidt? Mr. Schumer? Mr. Scott of Florida? Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Mrs. Shaheen? Mr. Sheehy? Ms. Lotkin? Ms. Smith? Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Thune? Mr. Tillis? Mr. Tuberville? Mr. Van Hollen? Mr. Warner? Mr. Warnock? Ms. Warren? Mr. Welch? Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Wicker? Mr. Wyden? Mr. Young? Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt-Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Hawley, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Ms. Alsobrooks. Ms. Alsobrooks, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Deans, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Hoeven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye.
This vote, the yeas are 49, the nays are 51, and the amendment is not adopted. Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you. To my colleagues, it's been a very long day. To the Budget Committee staff, Nick and your team, thank you very much. Through this process, I've got to know Senator Merkley better, and it's been a pleasure. We're one step closer to fixing a problem that all Americans want us to fix, I think. The man who murdered Laken Riley was released from detention because we had no bed space. That should never happen again. $175 billion in this bill to make sure we got enough bed space, we finish the wall, and kick gang members and other criminals out of the country. $150 billion for the military that's been worn out. They need the money. $20 billion for the mighty, mighty Coast Guard. We're one step closer to fulfilling a promise Republicans made to make you safer. I hope we can get one big, beautiful bill in the House, but we need to act on border security and national security now. We're running out of time. Thank you all.
Senator from Oregon.
I so much appreciate the collaboration and cooperation, communication between the budget team here on this side of the aisle and Senator Graham's team. And we have had the chance to all be on the floor and have a discussion about issues that we rarely get to have. It isn't quite the give and take that you might see in some legislatures, but we are, in fact, here wrestling with the national issues. This budget resolution comes down to one thing, and that is that families lose and billionaires win. I said at the beginning of the night that over the course of the evening, the amendments would show that Democrats are standing up for families on groceries, on health care, on housing, on education, on child care. And that's what's been demonstrated tonight. I still invite our Republican colleagues to join with us, and help the families of America rather than attacking the programs that serve them in order to fund tax giveaways for billionaires. Tax giveaways for billionaires will not make our nation stronger. Stronger families will make our nation stronger.
Order. The question occurs on adoption of the concurrent resolution as amended.
This bill will be paid for. I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks. Ms. Baldwin. I do. Thank you. Yep, gotcha.
Scott, aye.
Scott. Risch, Haggerty.
Great.
I gotcha.
All right.
Kane, gotcha. Thank you. Corn. Cantwell? Cantwell, no. Graham, gotcha. Got you. Yep. Capito. Oh my God. Thank you. Yep, do. Gotcha. McCormick. Shots.
When you can, sorry.
It's a nightmare. Kim, thank you.
Okay, you got David Dobbs Day.
You bet I do. Thank you.
You got Skate Tunnels in.
McConnell's at the door. Sir?
Thank you. You gotta have codes.
Gotcha.
Okay.
I like that. That's
Gotcha.
Curtis.
You're an aye. Curtis, thank you. Warren. Van Hollen. Gallego. Thank you. Eek. Sanders.
Well, we have to be on it. We won't be seeing each other. Yeah.
Warren. Yeah. Schiff. Barrasso. Mr. Banks.
Yes.
Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett.
Come on in.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Rose, aye.
Thank you.
Lummis, aye.
Thank you. Shaheen, Blumenthal.
Mullen, aye.
Yep, you bet. Bozeman. Gotcha.
Bud, aye.
Gotcha. Gillibrand.
Bud, you got me.
right, see you, man.
Cortez. Hickenlooper, Slotkin, White House. Blunt. Thank you.
Ricketts, aye.
I do. Wait a minute. Cassidy, Ricketts. I do. Thank you. Great. Gotcha. I did get you. Thanks.
Have a good weekend.
Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. You too. Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Sullivan, aye.
Probably not, but general default.
You bet. Have a good weekend. Thank you.
Thank you, Stud.
Thank you. Thank you. I do. Thank you.
Lee votes yes.
Gotcha. I got you. Gotcha. Yep, gotcha.
We're just ready to go.
You did get me, right?
I did. Thank you. Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker.
Yes.
Oh my God, you scared me. Yep. Somebody else got me. Yep. Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer,
Yes.
Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Marino, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, oh, God bless America. Thank you. Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoeven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Paul, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Langford, aye.
The concurrent resolution as amended is agreed to.
On this vote, the yeas are 52, the nays are 48. The concurrent resolution as amended is considered agreed to. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table. The Democratic leader.
President, tonight, one amendment at a time, Democrats exposed Republicans' true colors here on the Senate floor. For the first time this year, Senate Republicans were forced to go on record and defend their plans to cut taxes for Donald Trump's billionaire friends. What happened tonight was only the beginning. This debate is going to go on for weeks and maybe months. Democrats will be ready to come back and do this over and over again because Americans deserve to know the truth. And what is the truth? Under Donald Trump's Republican Party, billionaires win and American families lose. Billionaires win and American families lose. That's it. That's the Republican agenda. Tonight, we gave Republicans one chance after another to do the right thing and put the needs of American families first. We voted on amendments to prevent any tax cuts for billionaires, paid for with cuts to Medicaid. Republicans said no. We voted on an amendment to protect maternal and children's health care from draconian cuts. Republicans said no. We voted on an amendment to make it easier for Americans to rent or own a home. Republicans said no. Again and again and again, Republicans sent a clear and consistent message from the Senate floor. Under their agenda, billionaires win and American families lose. If Republicans continue with this reckless plan to help their billionaire buddies at the expense of American families, Democrats will make sure the American people know the truth at every opportunity. I yield the floor.
The Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 21.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Defense, Daniel Driscoll of North Carolina to be Secretary of the Army.
Mr. President, I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Daniel Driscoll of North Carolina to be Secretary of the Army, signed by 17 senators as follows.
Mr. President, I ask consent to reading the names be waived.
Without objection.
And I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to executive session and consider calendar number 22.
Question is on the motion. All in favor say aye. Opposed,
Aye.
no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Executive Office of the President, Jamison Greer of Maryland to be United States Trade Representative.
Mr. President, I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Jamison Greer of Maryland to be United States Trade Representative with the rank of Ambassador, signed by 17 senators as follows.
President, I ask consent to reading the names be waived.
Without objection.
And I ask unanimous consent that the Senate resume legislative session and be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I have one request for a committee to meet during today's session of the Senate. It has the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate now proceed to the in-block consideration of the following Senate resolutions which were submitted earlier today: S-Res 87, S-Res 88, and S-Res 89.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measures on block? Without objection, the Senate will proceed on block.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the resolutions be agreed to, the preambles be agreed to, and that the motions reconsidered be considered made and laid upon the table, all in block.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it stand adjourned until 3 p.m. on Monday, February the 24th, that following the prayer and pledge, the journal of proceedings be approved today, at the morning hour be deemed expired, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, morning business be closed, and the Senate proceed to executive session and resume executive calendar number 21, Daniel Driscoll to be Secretary of the Army. Further, notwithstanding Rule 22, that the cloture motions with respect to the Driscoll and Greer nominations ripen at 5:30 p.m.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, for the information of all senators, senators should expect multiple votes on Monday evening. If there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order.
Senate stands adjourned until 3 p.m. on Monday.